Hi, my name is Hadley Ochiltree, and along with Krista Stanford, I'm the Graduate Student Coordinator for the Speaker Series in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. Thank you for attending. We're so happy that you're here. The mission of the Speaker Series is to engage with leaders in the allied design professions. We are proud of our students, faculty, and facilities, and wish to demonstrate our hospitality to our guest speakers, for whom we are grateful. These talks are recorded for posterity, for use in studios, and the greater community. We ask you to be engaged during the talks, to listen, to quietly take notes, avoid digital distraction, and stay for the entire 1 hour duration. A short Q&A will follow the talk, after which you can scan the QR code for attendance, and then we'll meet in the common studio for a follow-up reception with some light refreshments. It's my pleasure to introduce R. Brooks Jeffery, Professor Emeritus of Architecture at the University of Arizona and a leading voice in heritage conservation. For more than 3 decades, his teaching, research, and outreach have advanced the idea that preserving our cultural landscapes is essential to environmental, cultural, and economic sustainability. He has authored or co-authored over 50 peer-reviewed articles and books, led major initiatives at the University of Arizona, and received national and state awards, including the National Park Service's Directors Partnership Award and the Excellence in Resource Stewardship Award, both in recognition of innovative leadership in the field of historic preservation. Brooks has also collaborated with civic agencies on preservation issues locally, regionally, and nationally, while serving as a board member on the University of Arizona Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, Arizona Historic Sites Review Committee, and the National Council for Preservation Education. This lecture, the Vern Budge Business Leadership Lecture, recognizes Vern Budge, a distinguished alumnus and emeritus professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. Vern received his BLA from Utah State in 1965 and his MLA from the University of Illinois in 1967. He was a full-time faculty member in the department for 36 years and contributed greatly to its national reputation for quality education. Vern was often recognized as the department's Teacher of the Year and Advisor of the Year, known for his belief that practical application of classroom information is the best teacher. Throughout his tenure at USU, Vern was also actively engaged in both private and public practice across the US and Canada, with several projects receiving national recognition from ASLA and APA. Today, R. Brooks Jeffery will present his lecture, Cultural Landscapes in the American West, Interpretation, Conservation, and Stewardship. We are so pleased to have you with us. Please join me in welcoming him.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Adley. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Can you all hear me? All right? Everything's good? Great. Oh, it's not changing here, though. I'll just start. So first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone who've been really gracious and welcoming me here. I've been here less than, or about 24 hours, and it's just amazing to see the hospitality that's here. I want to thank Keith for inviting me to come here. We've met a couple of years ago, and we've maintained a relationship and invited me here, I think because he was curious about the work that's being done in the realm of cultural landscapes and wanting to kind of share that as a lens to take a look at some of the work that's being done here at Utah State University. So Keith, thank you very much for that. And again, I've had the pleasure of attending a couple of studios this morning, and I need to say, this is a great school. You have great faculty. You all as students are inspiring, you're curious, you're kind. It's really inspirational for someone like me in an academic setting to be able to see that and come to a different program and be able to see that. You should be very proud of the work that you're doing here and all of the work that you'll continue to do. I'm just going to keep going forward, and I'll wing it. Could someone please call classroom support? There we go.
And try now.
All right, that's good. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. So my name's Brooks Jeffery. As it says, I'm a Professor Emeritus, and I want to remind people that I'm from the University of Arizona, not Arizona State University, which sometimes can get people confused. Carlos, you know, yeah, that's you. I'm from the school in southern Arizona, but today what I'm going to be talking about is really much more diverse than that. But I really wanted to be able to express my appreciation for the idea of sharing between institutions, because I think it's really important that we have this opportunity to do that. I also want to respectfully acknowledge where we are. And being here at the University, Utah State University, I'm adopting your land acknowledgement statement as a way for me to honor this region's indigenous communities. And hopefully in that way, I hope to aspire to continue the legacy of respect by doing this presentation in a way that's respectful to the indigenous communities and their descendants that are here. All right, like a good lecturer, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to recap it at the end, right? So in terms of a kind of an outline, I'd like to focus my first part of the presentation on definitions and constructs. And constructs are really as a fancy word of sort of ways of seeing, right? And so I'm gonna take a little bit of time to define what heritage conservation is, cultural landscapes, which is the really core theme of this presentation, and the American West, and we're really talking about in terms of the American West. I'm gonna present 3 case studies. 2 of them I'm very familiar with, I was involved with. The first 2 are from southern Arizona. And the third one was at a request really from Keith to kind of talk about something that's from here in Utah, and that's Bears Ears National Monument, and use the same lens that I'm approaching these others and really talk about Bears Ears. I'm not an expert in Bears Ears, but it has a lot of lessons for us to be able to learn from, and also to apply the same kind of frameworks that I'm going to be presenting. And then I'll conclude with some final observations and then open it up for some questions. So in terms of definitions, and I apologize in advance if some of you know some of these terms already, but I think it's really important that we take a bit of time just to kind of create a common denominator so that we have a shared understanding of the terms that we're going to be talking about. The first one is heritage conservation. Some of you may know this as historic preservation. And I choose to use the term heritage conservation very intentionally. First of all, when we talk about historic preservation, it's really about preserving history, right? When we use those terms. That's not really what we're talking about here. Heritage conservation, by those terms, really is about heritage, that which we inherit in terms of what our ancestors have given to us, and our role to steward them into the future for their use. In terms of conservation, I choose conservation because it's a much larger, broader term, and one used primarily by natural resource managers to talk about conservation as a living management paradigm. One which is much more encompassing and much more inclusive than the term preservation. When we think about preservation, we think about preserving like your grandmother's jam, right? It's preserves. It's sort of stuck in a particular bottle of a particular time. That's not what we're really talking about. Conservation is about living, evolving management systems, and that's a different kind of mindset when we do that. So when we talk about heritage conservation, when I talk to my students, and it's really about 3 different concepts. One is association with intangible humanistic constructs. Of course, it takes an academic to say something like that, right? What are humanistic constructs? It's the things that define those in the parentheses. How do we define significance for us individually, us as a community, us as a culture? Meaning, identity, values. We talked a little bit about that today in the studio that I attended in the morning. Things like culture and place, all these things are defined by us. We define them as humans, as a society, as individuals. How do we do that? And how do we associate tangible things, objects, landscapes, buildings, much broader landscapes in that way? I'm not going to talk about intervention, but it's an important key part of this. But I'm not going to talk about it today. This is really about how we do intervene in that landscape to make it, to act on that. but it's really about intervening on the tangible products of that, right? The things you can actually touch. And then I am going to be talking about stewardship. And I think it's really important to understand the definition that's used here. The process of managing change over time on behalf of future generations, right? We're not talking about now. We're talking about how do we steward something so that the next generation, our children and their children, can begin to appreciate it and have it serve in the same way that has benefited us. As I said, I'm really going to focus on the two, association and stewardship today. Okay? I'm going to drill down a little bit further on the association. We could talk about this, and you can see that it's really about identifying particular kind of values, right? These are those intangible things where the physical representation of a particular built environment or a landscape is really a representation of the values that created it at a particular time. So I'm in heritage conservation, I'm taking a look at the past through the lens of existing landscapes, existing buildings, and beginning to decipher what were the values that created that built environment at that particular time. And they can be divided into these sort of 7 value systems. One is environmental, right? Based on climate. The other studio in the afternoon, Carlos's studio, was really talking about how does environment inform how buildings are placed on a lot, how they are oriented, and how they're formed. Functional, we know these things, right? The relationship between task and space. Cultural, technological, right? All of these become lenses by which we can begin to assess particular value with the built environment. Economic, political, and aesthetic. And sometimes what I do when I talk to audiences or I talk to my students, I often ask them, take a look at the built environment around you and ask yourself, which one of these values is the one that drives current built environment, right? I could imagine most of you would say it's probably economic, right? Because you can look at the lens, through the lens of economic and say, this is really about finding the highest and best use of a piece of land. But what does that mean about our culture? What does that mean about our larger landscape and our larger built environment in terms of understanding the role of the environment, right? We were talking about in the studio this afternoon, wouldn't it be great to be able to look at a building or look at an urban context and be able to say, regardless of where it is, I know where that place is. I know what the environmental forces are that inform the design of that particular landscape. That doesn't necessarily happen today. There are these other values that begin to take primacy over that. But of course, that wasn't always the way. In previous generations of the built environment, we could begin to see some of those, and particularly in indigenous landscapes. Okay? So I welcome you to take a look at this as these lenses, and we're going to be referring back to them again today as we move forward to that. All right, the next term I'd like to define is cultural landscapes. The first person who really coined the term cultural landscape is this guy, Carl Sawyer, who defined, he was one of the pioneers of the field. And the idea here is this bottom quote where it's saying that culture is the agent. In other words, the one who is actually intervening then in the landscape. And the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape is the result. In other words, culture as an agent of change and how we begin to define that. He was then succeeded by this guy who I don't think I would allow to date my daughter, just based on the looks, but it's somebody who was a pioneer in the field, and that's J.B. Jackson. He was truly one of the great giants in the field of cultural landscapes. But what he says is really important here. Landscape is history made visible, right? There you go. There's the intangible history with the tangible landscape. The cultural expressions of and defined by a particular qualities of place. In other words, and again, we talked about it in studio, how do you define the essence of place? And what is our role as designers in the built environment to begin to understand how to be place makers, right? In terms of identifying what that essence is and making the space visible to that. And this attempt to derive meaning from landscapes that demands that we pay attention not to just some of the things around us, not just those aesthetic things or those technological things, those environmental things, but to all of them. The whole visible world and all of its rich, glorious, messy, confusing, ugly, and beautiful complexity. That's what the cultural landscape is. It's not particular about beauty. It's about understanding the meaning of the cultural landscapes. Whether it's a strip mall full of chain stores, what does that tell you about the landscape? What does it tell you about the values of a culture or a society that creates that, right? It's about those values again, okay? How do we express those values in our built form? Now, there are organizations, national and international, that also define cultural landscapes. So I'm sharing them here to have you realize that cultural landscapes is not an isolated phenomenon, but it's one that's embraced by all of the national and international organizations. And you can read there, but there are a couple of main things here. One is the relationship between cultural and natural resources, that they are linked, okay? The other here is the idea of providing a sense of place and identity. That's what we've been talking about just now. And then this idea of mapping our relationship with the land over time. So you have natural and cultural resources over time, okay? These are evolving kinds of constructs then as we move forward. All right, now when we take a look at cultural landscapes, I'm using the word paradigms here. Think of this as lenses. Okay? In the same way that we talked about values. When we take a look at landscape as nature, it's a lens. And we see them for the very descriptive, objective kinds of qualities that they show here. These are things of feature and topography. These are very objective kinds of things that can be measured. We also look at landscape as habitat. We look at the communities that inhabit those spaces, whether they're human, vegetative, or animal. We look at landscape as systems, and this is where we connect the dots. We have biomes. Right? We take a look at biomes as systems then, because they're interrelated with each other. When one falls apart, the other fails as well. We also take a look at landscape as aesthetics. We think about views and vistas as an intentional approach. We look at landscape as artifact. And again, the ugly as well as the beautiful, right? There's an equity when it comes to taking a look at that. And the importance of common things in defining that landscape. Again, these are lenses that we're using. And of course, landscape as ideology. We use this, and particularly the indigenous communities. The spiritual values that inhabit the landscape features are things we don't always understand because we are not in their worldview. But to their worldview, these have sacred significance, and we need to understand what those are. We also can look at landscape through the lens of wealth, right? The fact that we are exploiting for highest and best economic use. Okay, here's an image of an open pit mine in southern Arizona, right? That is a land use. And to a developer or to a mining company, this is the way and this is the lens that they look at the landscape. It's not for beauty. It's not as a series of systems. It's a way in which we can extract the kind of economic benefit from that land. We can also take a look at it as history and then as place. And place is a very interesting word here because place implies this idea of designation. It is a special place. You know, in my world, it's the National Register of Historic Places, right? There is a designation around what is sacred, what is significant, and then what is important to us. And we define that all the time. We may not necessarily use the words for that. And they can also be defined by different types. They can be historic. They can be historic design landscapes, vernacular landscapes, which again, talk about this idea of the intervention and agency of humans over time. And then ethnographic landscapes that are associated by different people as being significant. Now this is important, and the image there on the left is something where, again, we look at a saguaro cactus from my desert, the Sonoran Desert, and we look at it and say, yeah, it's beautiful. Well, to the indigenous people, it's a source of food. And that food is then used for ritual ceremonial purposes, right? That have a whole set of meaning in terms of reinforcing their cultural identity. I didn't know that, right? But it's the idea that some of these things have meaning, but beyond the lens and that we must be important. And to really understand that indigenous people, their view and their relationship of the land is about the continuity of place, the continuity of these resources through traditional cultural places and sites that then reinforce contemporary beliefs and practices. This isn't in the past for them. These are ongoing, continuing practices that require these kinds of resources. All right, the third definition that I'm going to go through, the American West. So when you think of the American West, okay, what are those characteristics that define the American West? You can kind of think of them in your head. It's not just what the movies tell us. What are those things? And so we can use the same kind of value systems that we talked about before. We can take a look at them from a geographic lens. And we can say there is a diversity here of the various kinds of features, whether it's the flora, the fauna. The coastal West is different than the intermountain West, the arid West. We can define them based on their geographic or their natural features that are there. We can also take a look at it in terms of cultural. How does the American West identify itself and the characteristics of its culture? There are indigenous cultures. There is the Spanish culture, right? Which is very much a prominent feature in the cultural history of the West. And you can see in this map here showing what was the Spanish colonial domain that took much of what is now the United States and the American West that's there, and also gave us names of state like California, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nuevo Mexico. These are all names that came out of that cultural tradition. And then we had the settlers, right? The pioneers that came through and that were then claiming the space for themselves. So this is a famous etching called Manifest Destiny, right? This is the idea that the people in the West, or the people in the East, felt that they had dominion over the people in the West, and that the people that were there before were just in their way, right? And so what do? They destroyed the buffalo that was a life way for the indigenous peoples as a way of conquering that space. So in the same way that the Spanish colonized indigenous Mexico, there was an American influence coming from the East that colonized the West and represented the values of the East in that process. And also it's important that we understand the diversity of the West, particularly afterwards. We don't always talk about the African American influence, but the Buffalo Soldiers, who were troops of the US Army, were incredibly important in the protection of the West, whether it was for national parks, setting up telegraph systems and roads and other kinds of things. They were important influence in the West, and we don't always give them credit. We have Native American communities that continue to have contemporary lifestyles that are here, and they choose to live in the way that they do, in a contemporary way. And also there are a variety of other ethnic groups. The Chinese, who established much of the railroads here, were laborers in the mines and others. These need to be understood as part of that cultural landscape that is here, and identifying particularly in the American West. You don't have this happening in the East, right? You're happening in the West because this was what was happening at the time. But I think one of the most important and more striking features of the American West is what I'll call the political definition. And that is this abundance of federally owned land. I mean, this image right here, way off to the left, to me is just fascinating, right? In terms of how much federally owned land is in the West versus east of the 100th meridian, right? So there is an abundance of federally owned land that is managed by a variety of different agencies, and you can see them color-coded here and identified. But we often think of, these are the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service. We've heard these names. We kind of all lump them together and say, well, they all are there to kind of protect the resources. Well, not really. The National Park Service does have a mandate of maintaining and preserving the heritage in particular. The Forest Service, yes, to protect the resources, but in a way in which to fuel an economy. Bureau of Land Management is really about maintaining recreational use for a lot of the land, as well as providing economic development, right? So it's this balancing act of trying to protect resources, but at the same time making them available for economic development, primarily by capitalists in the East, right? So the West became this place where Eastern capital was done to exploit the land, extract from the land, think of all the mining that was going on here, as well as then extracting the capital and the potential of that was there. This is all part of the makeup of the American West, particularly from the lens of someone living in the East. And again, we took a talk about the economic, and we've mentioned this before. You know, in Arizona, every high school student goes through an Arizona history class, and they're taught that the economics of Arizona are represented in the 5 C's, right? It's cotton, copper, citrus, climate, and cattle, right? That was the economic drivers, okay? Particularly in the 19th century. So these were all about sort of how do we take the West and create economic opportunities there. What is now, interestingly enough, what is the economic driver in the West in particular, and you see it here in Utah, is growth, which is why I show this image of sprawl. That growth is actually an economic sector in terms of how jobs are created and how the economies are funded. And so you take a look at the economic kind of division of how these are the economic development of places like Utah or in Arizona. Growth is a major driver then, and replacing a lot of times the idea of cattle or citrus in this idea. And then aesthetic, right? We often look at the West as this place of aesthetic beauty. Attracted lots of artists and writers and other creatives over time. And because of the sort of exotic quality of this place that you can't find elsewhere. One of my favorite quotes is by Charles Bowden, who wrote in The Blue Desert that the Southwest in particular, but I think you can talk about the American West, is a place where the land always makes promises of aching beauty, and the people always fail the land. Right? It's this idea that we see beauty in the land, but we can't help ourselves. We can't help ourselves in wanting to go in and somehow make it better. And by doing that, then we take away the beauty that actually was there to begin with. So to sum up in terms of the American West, I want to just make sure that you emphasize the fact that there are diverse resources that define the West and these characteristics, but it's also about the values that generated those. So then the question when it comes to conservation is, whose story do we tell? For whom are we going to do the conservation? Who are the values that are going to represent this next generation of stewarding the land into the future? And these are some of the challenges that we're facing and that we'll talk about in the next set, which is case studies. Okay, you with me so far? All right, good. All right, now let's take a look at some examples then. The first one that I want to mention, as I said, is the first 2 are from southern Arizona. First one is Tumamoc Hill. Tumamoc Hill is located in the western valley of Tucson, a satellite view of Tucson. This is the valley of Tucson right here, surrounded by mountains, a riverbed here, and the mountains to the west. And the circle represents where Tumamoc Hill is. It's a geographic feature volcanic in its formation that rises up from the landscape to about 800 feet. And you can see it just as this promontory of a hill that's there. And Tumamoc is actually an indigenous name that translates as Horned Lizard Mountain, right? Implying again that these toponyms, places that are named based on the place that they're in, just like Tucson. People say, well, Tucson, why do you spell it Tucson? Well, it's because it's a transliteration of the term Tucson, which is an indigenous term for at the base of the Black Mountain, the mountain that we're talking about here. So we have place names that are based on geographic features that, again, bind the definition of place into the name itself. So this is hugely populated by saguaros. I don't know if you can see it in this image. All of these sticks are all saguaros. There's a saguaro forest that surrounds this. And these saguaros then, again, are sacred to the indigenous peoples that are there, as well as just creating this amazing kind of aesthetic that occupies the desert. So again, we're talking about those features that we talked about, right? In terms of the themes that we mentioned before. We can talk about the culture that was there. There's a prehistoric culture that dates back about the time of Christ, that were the Hohokam people, now called the ancestral Sonoran desert people. They created a set of cultural features there, including, you can see on the slides from the far left, the kind of milling stations or mortars that were based in the bedrock. So this is pure bedrock that we're talking about. We had rock art and petroglyphs, agricultural fields, water control features, roasting pits for agaves. So you think of tequila, for example, as coming from the agave, which comes from the desert. That all started with the indigenous practice of roasting agaves. You see that practice in indigenous communities all over the Southwest. But what's distinct about this particular mountain and distinct to this culture are these rock walls. And you can see the remnants of these right along the edges here. And they form these terraces. They're called, in Spanish, they're called trincheras, which translates as sort of fortresses, but they weren't really fortified. They were really just sort of layers to allow agriculture to take place on a higher plane. So these were higher plane because they were in a defensive posture, so they could begin to take a look out to the valley. So this has a promontory view and promontory function for Tucson, because they were able to see far away, see the enemy that was coming, and be protected from the people that might cause conflict. But what was interesting about this is that these lines then, they're called cerros de trincheras, these hills, would also communicate with other hills. And so you had this communication that would go on between the hills among the tribes and the colonies that occupy these hills. So the promontory hills were almost like, if you want to think about them as natural form pyramids. The fact that they were elevated above the valley floor meant that they had spiritual significance, but they also had a very clear functional purpose of protection. And these became very important in this process, particularly for the indigenous cultures. You can also take a look at, again, in terms of how this was functioned and the systems that we talked about before as a value. So beginning in 1903, Tumamoc Hill was designated as the Carnegie Desert National Laboratory. Started off as 40 acres and then grew to 884 acres. And it became a laboratory to study the saguaro cactus because there was such a high concentration of cactus that was there. There was a U.S. Forest Service experimental station there. The University of Arizona then took it over in 1960. And what did they use it for? To study the saguaro. The saguaro was an indicator species for the health of the desert, as well as understanding the wildlife and natural ecosystems that were there. And then they divided it up. They had all these different parcels then. And so these were understood as various ways in which you could take a landscape and create their own sort of systems of analysis and understanding where different slope conditions then affected the ways in which saguaros and other plants lived. In 2006, no, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go on further. Oh, and then so the images here are showing the Carnegie Desert Laboratory. It sat on the knee of the hill right over in here. Then it was a group of buildings where scientists would hang out and study the saguaro cactus, and created a set of buildings from the early 1900s then in their experimentation. And once this got associated with the University of Arizona, then it became part of the kind of research mission at the University of Arizona. But when we talk about land ownership then, it wasn't based on anything related to the topography or the ecology of the place. It was based on pure kind of surveys of what could be done by creating linear demarcations on the landscape as if it were a flat plane. Okay? Again, this is a construct of understanding how landscapes work and how humans begin to delineate ownership and then therefore how they view the land. Not as ecosystems, but as land ownership, right? in a survey way, in which they're using Cartesian kinds of ways in which to divide up the space in a way that objectifies the land from the actual ecology that's there. And so there were three parties that took place that were the owners here. It says the city of Tucson is now owned by the county entity. This part in red is owned by the University of Arizona, and then this part owned by the city of Tucson. And so there was this partnership that was going on. Each had their own purpose that was there. The U of A was doing research. The city of Tucson wanted the right-of-way in order for them to be able to do transportation and infrastructure investments along there. And the city of Tucson had a city park that became part of a reserve that was here. Each one of them had different uses for them and were using and managing the hill completely independent of one another. This became a problem. And there were other users of the hill, one of which was they were using the road. Walkers began to walk up the hill that were using to going up to the Desert Laboratory, which is right up on the knee of the hill, and they were using it for recreation purposes. I'm sure, John, when you were there, you probably walked up the hill too. It was a place that you did because it had so much exercise. But it also had this kind of recreational, but also almost even a spiritual quality to it. It was a community of people who did this. And so it became part of the kind of character of the place, that it became a place that was known as a place where you could go and meet other people and recreate with them. On top of the hill, the same reason that you see archaeological finds on the top of the hill, which are located here, are the drawn features here. These black features were satellites. And so the hill was being used in the same way that the indigenous people saw it as a sentinel, a place to look out and be able to see. It was the same function that TV stations and radio stations wanted to put their antennas, because it was the tallest place in the valley to be able to communicate out. And so they put their antennas, their 20th century antennas, on top of the archaeological remains that were there. Okay? A clear imposition of one set of values over another. And of course, then you have the O'odham community, the indigenous community that has association with this hill. This is a sacred hill to them, not only because of their ancestors, but because of the way in which it's used to collect resources for healing purposes, as part of their rituals to gather the kinds of harvesting and the herbs that they need for their rituals, but also as the process of teaching the next generation. All of that then became part of the conflict that we saw at Tumamoc Hill. So, in summary, what happened was, beginning sometime in the 2000s, the University of Arizona recognized that there were these conflicting kinds of uses, conflicting ownership models, and conflicting consequences that were happening on Tumamoc Hill. So they formed a team to get together to define a management plan. And again, this is in the early 2000s. There weren't a lot of precedents that were there. I was part of a team that represented cultural resources, not just in terms of the archaeological, but also in terms of the 20th century cultural resources that were there. And so we began then a process of, what is the problem? We need to identify what are the key features of the problem. And here's what we've defined. We have multiple and often conflicting values. Okay, again, going back to values, okay, among the various stakeholders. There was a common need for the protection of the natural and cultural resources, regardless of their use. And then a need for greater awareness and the management of common stewardship responsibilities. In other words, we needed to come together, okay? But we just didn't have a roadmap to do that with. And part of this then, that we had to reach out and begin to talk to each of these stakeholders. And in this process, it was revealed just the diversity and the amazing number of people who felt and took a stewardship role in this as stakeholders. So you have the indigenous communities who see this as a traditional cultural place. They could care less about the antennas. They could care less about the saguaro plots that were being investigated by the University of Arizona. It is a sacred landscape and should be protected, period. You have, again, this sort of desert ecosystem research was by a number of different departments within the College of Science at the University of Arizona. You also had archaeological research with 2 units at the University of Arizona. Also, the land on top of the hill was owned by the University of Arizona and leased to telecommunications. So the university is complicit in this idea because they're leasing the land to that. So it involved real estate and business affairs because there's money exchange for this, right? They're leasing the land for that. And then there's utilities and right-of-way leases that were a part of that whole landscape right at the base of the hill that was owned by then the city of Tucson and ultimately Pima County. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a whole community who looks at Tumamoc Hill for no other reason than to climb the hill on a Friday evening, right? To join some of their neighbors and begin to do something together as part of an exercise routine and what might even be called spirituality. It was engaging with nature in a very special way. These were all the various stakeholders were there. It's like, okay, now what do we do? So we got together, and what we ended up doing by meeting with each of these different stakeholder groups, we came together to try to find common ground and ultimately led to the creation of this, which is the Tumamoc Hill Cultural Resources Management Plan. Okay? And again, for 2008, this was seen as a pretty progressive document because we were listening to all the stakeholders. And we recognized the diverse values that were represented in each of them. But we also then had to come up with common ground that for the mutual benefit of all of us, we needed to begin to compromise on some of those things. And so this was the mission statement that came out of this: to protect and preserve the prehistoric and the historic resources, continued ecological research and educational opportunities, and then safeguarded for the benefit of future generations. Again, going back to that definition of stewardship. It's not just about now. It's about how do we protect this for future generations. And then to foster community collaboration. Okay, this idea that we would have to work together. Regardless of our particular distinct kind of uses, we had to work together as a public investment. Okay? So this is the end result of this. And this is one of the case studies that I wanted to share with you because it was this idea of coming together both of natural and cultural resources, okay, recognizing a variety of different, very diverse stakeholders, and then coming together in creating and recognizing a cultural landscape. And it was really in recognizing a cultural landscape, a term that was not very common in 2000s, to be able to look at this then as this integration of nature and culture. The next case study that I want to share with you is the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. The Sonoran Desert, you can see some of the kind of images that are there, is recognized as one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in the world. It is, let me repeat that, most biologically diverse ecosystems in the world. And you think of a desert, and you don't necessarily think of that kind of diversity, and particularly biological diversity. But it is amazing that quantity that's there, and which has sustained civilizations for millennia as a result. The other notion here, and what I want you to understand, the Sonoran Desert then is distinct from Carlos, my colleague, who came from Chihuahua. The Chihuahuan Desert is a very distinct place from the Sonoran Desert. Here, the Great Desert, which is further up here, the Mojave Desert, which is over in. Sometimes you think of the desert and you think of the American West, but in actuality, the physical characteristics of each of these areas mean that each one has distinct geographical features that are there. And also to understand, this was done in Pima County. So the Sonoran Desert, where Tucson is here and Tucson is here, really encompasses the county of Pima here, which the major city is Tucson. And Pima County is this vast land base. In the West, this is one of the other characteristic features, is the fact that counties and land masses, their political boundaries, are huge compared to the East, right? When we talk to our Eastern colleagues, I have to remind people that this 9,000 square miles that encompasses Pima County is the equivalent of 2 states and a Rhode Island, right? So 3 states can fit into 1 county in Pima County. And that's not uncommon here in the West because of the size of this. But it also means that there is a leadership opportunity when it comes to resource management. This is one entity, Pima County, that can begin to take a leadership position on how we steward the land that primarily encompasses the sort of zone of the Sonoran Desert. So they saw this as an opportunity. Now, the other thing that is characteristic here is the area of Pima County, the majority of it, about 1/2 of the landmass, is occupied by the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation. And this is, and was the ancestral home to the Hohokam. And there were, it's the 2nd largest Indian reservation in the United States. Okay, so again, we have these large land masses governed by one particular kind of entity. And the Hohokam, their ancestors, were some of the most sophisticated agriculturalists that were enabled to survive in the desert. You add on top of that, then, the Spanish. And you saw the map earlier. You have the Spanish colonial presence that brought in missions. They brought in ranching landscapes. It was the Spanish who introduced cattle and horses into the West. And it was them that overlaid on top of this landscape this whole kind of cultural overlay. And then this created ranching communities that lasted through into the American period of occupation in the Sonoran Desert. And in essence then, Pima County, the landmass then, is really a cultural tell, right? It's this layering of different cultures that then put their fingerprints on the landscape, whether it's as agriculturalists, as those who are cattle ranchers, those who are there to colonize, and those who are there to be exploitative in terms of mining that took place. The other issue that came across, and you find it here in Utah too, is growth, as I mentioned. So what's happening in Pima County is that Pima County growth was consuming 10 square miles of desert every year, right? So you begin to multiply that over the course of 10 to 20 years. And as the long-range planning was taking place, they recognized that if we didn't do something now, we would begin to consume all of the desert, all of these delicate and diverse biosystems in a way that we would then destroy that diversity. So, beginning in 1998, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan was launched. And what was unique about it was not only was it comprehensive, but it was science-based. They brought in ecologists, they brought in land managers, they brought in biologists in order to begin to understand what are the basic kind of biomes that are there, what are the wildlife communities, and really taking a systems approach and understanding not just what is there now, but also this idea of being much more inclusive about the vocabulary of having natural resources as well as cultural resources, as well as defining optimal resource capacity, right? This idea that they're looking 25 years into the future and saying, what can the desert support if we're going to have continued growth? What could it not support? How do we create a sustainable way to do that? And what are going to be the impacts on the land as well as the other kind of resources such as water that's there? So this really expanded on the previous kinds of efforts of land acquisitions which took place by Pima County for conservation, but it was really about the protection of critical habitats that were there. So in 2005, the governing entity, the Board of Supervisors in Pima County, adopted the Conservation Land Systems, the CLS. And this is the map that you're seeing here. So this was then creating a whole sort of roadmap and mapping of all of the delicate and sensitive biomes that were there, identified cultural resources that should be protected, wildlife corridors, not just spaces, but corridors, migratory movements that were taking place. And, and really a whole set of goals, and then limiting those areas that would be appropriate for development. So it became this comprehensive land plan that allowed for the planners to know where you should develop and what should be protected. And then a roadmap for how do we define what should the county, in this case, purchase in order to then acquire the lands and put them into protection. So that's what this map then ended up doing. So after the adoption of it in 2004, and we were talking about this earlier in the class, there was a bond election. Bonds are basically money that can be borrowed, but based on voter approval. So what did Pima County have to do? They had to make the case to the voters in order to say, this is our future. We want to protect the Sonoran Desert. We want to be responsible and sustainable about our urban growth. We're not saying no to growth. We want it to be smart. And we have a roadmap to be able to define what is smart growth. And so in doing that then, they outlined a whole set of projects of what needed to be purchased, how they need to engage with landowners for the protection of sustainable and continued use of the land, like for ranching or for farming, and then to protect that land so that when it deeded down to the next generation, it would continue to be used for agricultural purposes. So in a very intentional approach to doing that. And then define what that was going to be over the next 10 years. And so those of you who are kind of geeking out on this, it's this idea of how much money are we talking about? $173 million went to the voters and they approved, right? So what they're paying for and we paid for over the course of 10 years was a 1 cent sales tax, 1 cent property tax to be able to fund this, so we could pay back the bond. But it was about having money up front to begin to implement this plan. And what did that equal? It equaled the purchase of 50,000 acres of land that were identified as critical habitat and critical areas for priority purposes based on this larger Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. So what were the goals? The goals were, as you can see, and I'm just focused on the key words there. It's about balancing the cultural and natural resources, as well as maintaining economically vigorous kinds of responsible planning and community growth. It talked about the continuity of traditional uses that are there, including farming and ranching. We weren't replacing ranching and farming lands with housing. No, we were wanting to have that be continued and to have that be part of open space. Recognizing the role of ecotourism as an economic sector. So by preserving heritage that was there, it produced another sector of our economy that drove people to go there and have proven to be quite successful. As well as protecting traditional cultural places. Again, that's a euphemism for indigenous ancestral lands and the spiritual values that are associated with it, as well as conserving natural habitats. So these were the goals that were set up as part of this larger plan. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It took years to do this. There was a whole set of working groups that were done. There was something like 600 public meetings, 200 technical reports, 115 consulting scientists and experts, okay? I being one of them, right? This was a very comprehensive and inclusive process. And they created task forces to take a look at each one of those things. But more importantly, there was a partnering that took place here. Pima County did not do this in isolation. They partnered with the National Park Service, with the Nature Conservancy, Arizona Land and Water Trust, the Tohono O'odham Nation, Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, on and on and on, okay? These were the land steward agencies that were helping with the protection, whether it's flood control or the protection of species. And we're all working together in partnership toward a common plan. And that's what resulted in the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. And I want to sort of highlight two of the 5 different plan elements that are there. These are on cultural resources and then ranch conservation. The other are riparian restoration, critical habitat biological corridors, and conservation reserve and a development reserve. In other words, carving out what is appropriate for development and what is not. And again, you can begin to see the identification of not just sites, but actual areas. And these areas represented biomes that were important to indigenous people for the harvesting of herbs or harvesting of crops for their ritual practices. It was also about, in terms of ranches, what was understood was much of the land that was around in this area was then owned by private sector and were typically ranches or farmlands. And by creating land agreements with the property owners there, then they were able to maintain them as open space. What was really interesting, though, is that it de facto created an urban growth boundary, right? So instead of allowing sprawl to take place down into the valley where there would have been plenty of open space for development, no, it was actually preserved in creating a ring around the city to begin to hold on urban sprawl. And what that meant was the community then defined a goal of densification that then became part of a land use plan that was part of that. So what are the impacts? We're now in the 24th year of the implementation, and it's now considered one of the exemplars of resource management at this scale. And again, we're talking about a huge scale, over 9,000 square miles. First of all, it established this ethic of balance between conservation and economic development. Again, oftentimes seen as opposing forces coming together and saying we have mutual goals, we have mutual then impacts, and we have mutual responsibility in order to get us there. This is what is managing the stewardship of the land. The land acquisition of over 250,000 acres, including county preserves, wildlife movement corridors, and historic ranches. Cooperative agreements with public and private landowners for the cooperative land management practices. And then spawned the Santa Cruz Valley National Heritage Area designation. So this image on the left here is that land right there. The Santa Cruz Valley is actually named after the river. So Tucson is right up in here, and the river that runs through it is the Santa Cruz River that actually goes down into Mexico and then goes northward then to further up and out of the county. But then this corridor and this National Heritage Area is not based on a particular cultural definition, but based on a watershed, right? The Santa Cruz River watershed, which was the impetus for human occupation for the last 3,000 years, right? So that became the definition of how you define not just protection of the natural resources, but also the cultural resources. And now a National Heritage Area was created, which provides financial incentives for the maintenance of cultural resources, protections for land use so that it can be maintained for. And if anybody, this is where you can find the plan. And again, you'll see it as this gets published. If you're looking for it, for the online kind of version of this, I highly recommend it. It's a model plan. It's very innovative. The last one that I'm going to show is the Bears Ears National Monument. And again, with the caveat, that I'm not an expert on Bears Ears. But what I'm going to do is to take the same kind of criteria that we've been talking about and take a look at it from the same lens of stewardship and cultural landscapes. So, for those of you who don't know, the landscape was first inhabited 8,500 years ago by Pueblo peoples, and then followed up by the Ute, the Navajo or Diné, and also then the Paiute peoples. It is recognized as an ancestral landscape with over 100,000 registered cultural belongings. Notice they don't call them sites, they don't call them resources, okay? The indigenous people here call them belongings, okay? It's a very different, again, using nomenclature begins to change your worldview of how they look at it. This includes sacred places, including springs and waterways, canyons, plants and animals, archaeological sites, cliff dwellings, towers, roads, petroglyphs, you can see them all there, as well as natural landmarks, again, that are used for spiritual significance. The descendant indigenous communities continue to practice these spiritual and cultural traditions. They continue to gather resources there and care for the sacred sites. So in the Bears Ears, for those of you who don't know, is named after this particular landmark feature here, which reflects then the bear as the guardian spirit of the Ute people. So let's talk about a recent timeline. After decades of trying to work collaboratively, and the land that was part of this whole area was run by the Bureau of Land Management along with the U.S. Forest Service. Again, if you remember, the definitions of their mission and mandates are often very, very different. Some were considered extractive. Others were for protection for recreation, right? It wasn't necessarily about protection of ancestral remains at all. And so there was an attempt to kind of create a collaborative stewardship model. But it was only until the creation of this Bears Ear Intertribal Coalition that was really trying to create a new paradigm for how we represent the kind of conflicting and address the kind of conflicting land values that are there. So this was a cooperation between not just the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, but 5 tribes that don't always get along together, okay? They are the Navajo, Dene, the Hopi, the Ute Indian tribe, and the Pueblo Zuni, okay? They have their own distinct identities, but they were coming together because each had an association with their ancestral ties to this landscape. A year later, Bears Ear National Monument was established by President Obama and consisted of 1.3 million acres, okay? Remember that number, okay? Which was all part of pre-existing federal land, okay? There were no tribal lands associated, no state, none of this. It was all patchwork of federal lands, but it was all brought together as a national monument, as a collective entity, just like we talked about in some of those other cases. And this really represented kind of a bold and untested stewardship model in the US. If we go to Canada, if we go to Australia, this kind of tribal plus federal agency stewardship models are very common. Not so common here in the United States. So this was really a pioneering effort to begin to come up with a new way of taking a look at this. A year later, President Trump came in and reduced the monument by 85%, leaving the sites vulnerable to looting, vandalism, and open to extractive industries, which again, different value system, right? They took a look at the lands not for the protection of cultural indigenous lands, but rather for extractive purposes. So you can see the size of this went from this down to that. And it's this, and again, what it revealed was this tension between preservation, conservation, land stewardship versus ownership and extractive kinds of economic development, and this kind of back and forth depending on who was in charge to be able to do that. 2021, President Biden restores the monument to 1.36 million acres, and then led to this cooperative agreement with the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service with the Bears Ears Tribal Coalition as being a co-manager of this. So they were designating the tribal entity, this tribal agency, as a co-manager along with the federal agencies. Again, kind of untested territory then. Fast forward to today, 2025. So over this time period then was the creation of this unified approach and this cooperative approach to create a resource management plan, not unlike the one that we talked about at Tumamoc Hill. By establishing, and again, this is what's really important, a collaborative stewardship based on the principles of traditional indigenous knowledge. So again, a new way of taking a look at stewardship then that was based on traditional indigenous knowledge. And the characteristics of that are as they're defined there. It's holistic, it's place-specific and long-term, experiential as well as empirical, and culturally embedded, dynamic and evolving. Okay? So these were the principles that began to define how they went forward. So those values then are defined by, again, by those traditional indigenous knowledge based in spirituality. Okay, as a value system, right? We go back to those value systems we talked about before. Spirituality as a value system on the land. Respect, okay? Respect for the indigenous view of the world, okay? It became very important in the designation of this. And also tribal sovereignty over the lands with government-to-government consultation authority, okay? This is policy speak for the idea that you have to talk to each other. Okay? Consultation means that you are mandated to talk to each other when you're having any kind of use that is in conflict with the management policy. You have to talk about it. It wasn't You go off and do your thing, I'll go off and do my thing, and we don't really care about what we're doing. No, you have to talk to each other. So then, in terms of the goals, guided monument stewardship, and again, unlike the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, where I was proud to be able to say we're in our 24th year and we're doing really well, right? We've got a whole new mindset there. This is brand new, fresh off the press, right? 2025 was when this plan was created. Who knows? Who knows what now Trump 2.0 is going to do with this land? Who knows that in 24 years from now, what this is going to look like? But it's meant to then guide this as a stewardship partnership with the federal government. Again, not new for places like Canada and Australia, but new to the United States. It was honoring tribal sovereignty, and then a balance, again, this balance of nature and culture and the preservation, but allowing for the appropriate recreation and resource use. Okay? So I'm going to close. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'm going to close with some kind of final observations then, and we can open it up for some questions. So first is kind of, if these are the takeaways from the presentation, this is what I'd like you to take away. Cultural landscapes as a paradigm then represent this integration of nature and culture and a continuum of time. They are living and evolving. They are not stuck. They are not preserved in time. They are conserved as an evolving kind of living paradigm. That the conservation of cultural resources, cultural landscapes must be transdisciplinary. We need to bring in the biologists as well as the resource managers, as well as tribal and indigenous knowledge, and begin to steward the features and understand that there are intangible values that have tangible representation on the landscape, and need to understand that association between the two. And distinguish land stewardship from land ownership. Okay? The indigenous cultural landscapes require a different way of thinking. Recognizing non-human entities have agency in the tribal worldview and are endowed with powers and gifts that are reinforced by creation stories and rituals. This is why they do this, right? To continue that ethic and to share that with the subsequent generation. And that the multi-party collaborative stewardship model sees the landscape as an interconnected whole. Okay? Again, taking the holistic lens. Unlike the Western kind of mentality, where we seem to divide and classify based on separate values. And you notice that I talked about those values, right? I broke those down. I try to create objective kinds of systems by which to categorize and systematize all of this. But in fact, we're really talking about bringing them all together. Okay? And kind of blurring the lines between all of those, but recognizing them all, but blurring the lines in terms of solutions that need to be done, even if they are representing conflicting kind of views. And that really this idea of listening to all the parties and defining the values and those things that you have in common. And I just want to kind of end with this quote, which I think is just sort of summarizes this, is this idea that this idea of landscape cannot be itemized. It needs to be thought of as holistically, and that it becomes part of a mindset that is there. And with that, I want to sort of open it up for questions, and thank you for your attention.